Call this meeting to order. The Canby Planning Commission meeting for Monday, February 10th, 2014. In attendance, we have Mr. John Surlett, Commissioner Sean Hensley, Commissioner John Savory, and myself, Commissioner Tyler Smith. We have on the agenda for today, the first item of business is the selection of a vice chairman. Are there any motions or discussion about the topic of selecting a new vice chairman?
I have both, sir. I would like to nominate Mr. John Savory under the precedent that we've already had Mr. Savory take your position at times. I think he's got the most. I think he's got the most board experience out of us all, and I think he'd do a great job.
Any other? Is there a second on that?
I second that.
Okay. Is there any discussion on the nomination of Mr. Savory for the vice chair of the Planning Commission?
Discussion, Mr. Savory?
Any comments? Campaign speech?
Vote for me and I'll set you free.
Okay. Not hearing any other discussion of any other nominations. You would like to nominate anybody?
No. I'm good.
Okay. All those in favor of Mr. Savory being selected as the vice chair signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. I note that there were 3 ayes. Did you not vote for anything?
I voted for myself.
Oh, you did vote.
Yeah,
Okay, 4 ayes. Okay. The next item of new business is staff's presentation of text amendment changes to the code for downtown landscaping and 2-story building requirements.
Okay,
Would you like to go ahead?
I'll go ahead real quick because I don't have much to say tonight. We've gone through 2 work sessions now with the Planning Commission, the first back in December, to go over our current code provisions dealing with 2-story height requirements in the downtown core commercial area of the downtown Canby overlay, and the related provisions in the code dealing with downtown. And then we followed up with another work session that highlighted the landscaping provisions that are in the downtown area. And we touched upon as they would relate to the rest of the community as well, just for comparison purposes. But the focus has been to really to focus in and decide if our code, in your opinion, needs any changes related to 2-story height requirements and landscaping in the downtown area. We emphasized in our discussion that the current 2-story requirement only applies to the C1 zoned area that lies in the core commercial sub-area of the downtown area. It doesn't include the other side of Highway 99E that is considered downtown Canby by the overlay district because it's not in the core commercial sub-area. And we talked about landscaping provisions in the downtown in relation to what you see today in what's mostly developed, a vision that was in our adopted downtown plan that started in 2001 and was finally adopted with code provisions in 2004. And the predominant input from the public at that time was towards having 2-story building requirement, and also to have landscaping with new buildings. Some of our primary discussion was, in terms of landscaping, do we really need the 7.5% requirement that's currently in the code, with some comparison to places at City of Portland and their downtown that doesn't have any requirement, to our knowledge, to recognizing that we have some landscaping associated with many of our buildings in the downtown, but on a whole, probably less than 7.5 today. So taking those kind of things into account. And at this point, we haven't done any further research. We'd hope to compare some percentages in similar-sized towns. It's something I'd like to do, if necessary, to help us come to a conclusion on this. And then with regard to the two-story requirement, recognizing that our downtown's predominantly one-story now, but that we have some good examples of two-story buildings that fit in very well in the downtown, and how important that has been proven for many other towns across the nation to identify your downtown area as being a unique place of higher intensity use than you'll find in any other zone district applicable to your community. So it's a pretty common provision to allow height greater in your downtown area than anywhere else. Not necessarily to absolute require two-story buildings, at least in my knowledge in Oregon. But certainly there are requirements for two stories all across the nation in small towns in order to differentiate zoning districts, just like I indicated. The other thing that helps differentiate that we talked about was zero setbacks, allowing full lot coverage with buildings. And you understand we have a defined area, which is very common too, where there's no on-site parking required in a downtown area. That isn't applicable anywhere else in the rest of the zoning districts. And so that's very different for a downtown area. And when you do that, eventually there's going to have to be a provision of public parking if you're not going to provide any on-site parking, and an entire downtown redevelops without parking. You're not going to have a successful downtown unless you have adequate parking. And if you're not providing it on-site, then you need public garages or public surface parking lots. And of course, that's what Canby has done, recognizing the need for that. We have the railroad parking lot that's just finished and developed, and we have the theater public parking lot, so that we have kind of two anchors of public parking in the downtown area. And by a parking study that was done and updated just past year indicated Canby currently has more than adequate parking in the entire downtown area. There may be some localized areas where people really feel it's a little bit short, they have to walk a little bit too far, but as a whole, we have excess parking in the downtown area right now. And then just real quickly, maybe for Chair Smith, I think the rest of you were here when I explained this last time, but I know you were hopeful to get some direction on these two topics from the City Council. And they did discuss this at a meeting, and I tried to summarize the direction I got from them, and so I will paraphrase what that was again. They could not agree or provide any specific direction, but they did make some general statements that the Planning Commission and staff might be able to focus and respond to. They believe we are likely to see new construction in the downtown area and want to make sure that our regulations reflect what modern zoning theory would require for a downtown area in terms of having the right landscaping ratio and whether to require two-story buildings, and if so, whether any exceptions to that two-story requirement are appropriate. They wanted to make sure these items were reviewed and considered by the Planning Commission. So that's just very general direction to you. They're not forcing a change because they had no direction specifically for you, but they feel like it's very important that we feel like our downtown plan and current regulations are heading in the right direction. And so it's your opportunity at this point to make that decision, and whatever direction you provide, staff will go work on that and come back with something specific for you to look at. But at this point, we don't know whether to head towards a definitive two-story or the other direction, and vice versa with landscaping. Is it okay as it is? Do we need to make some changes? So I'm just going to kind of leave it for the chair here to lead some discussion around these topics.
Okay. The one thing that I had noted last time that I would certainly push for us to take into account is, how do I say this properly, setting up the system so that we are not being hypocritical. If we have a provision, that it should be enforceable. For instance, we had with the the total coverage of planted areas, where we talked about, you can check that before the occupancy permit is issued, but then after that point in time, there's essentially nobody checking on that ever, on this square footage and percentages
On the
of,
landscape itself.
yeah, well, and of the planted areas. What where I'm thinking of is, I think it's what, the 95% ratio, that
Yeah,
in 3 years it's supposed to cover
Right.
95%, and we just
Right.
literally have, my understanding, we don't have anybody that would even ever pay attention to
The
that.
potential to do that is very low, to go out and check to see after 3 years whether the ground cover has covered 95% of the landscaped area.
That's
So
one thing that
that's
struck
one-
me
one
as something
item.
that we ought to try to craft the code in a way that we avoid those types of situations where we're put in that odd scenario where the provision is such that we're forcing someone to do something that nobody's even going to check on ever.
I think it's silly, but
That was one that stuck out with me. I mean, I don't know, I don't have some language or anything, Brian, to ask you guys to change
And that's
this particular
fine. I think
provision.
we're looking more for kind of general direction so that we can come up with something that you can respond to.
Anybody else have any thoughts from the last ones and things?
One of the things that I realized as I started looking at this was that as I was looking at these pieces that were brought to us in the landscape and the second story, it was relative to other pieces in the other parts of the code. And I don't know that we can, or should, for that matter, go directly at just these two pieces. I mean, is this something that we need to address more of the overall Chapter 16 book to assess these two parts to make it all flow? I mean, to make it all go together. Because I was looking at this and this piece is relative to that piece, it's relative to that piece. So we can't, I see it as we can't really change one piece in the middle and not have it contradict, like you're saying, maybe something else. I mean, I don't know that it's something we can just,
It is something we need to keep in mind. It's possible for us to make suggestions on these two areas without harming or adversely impacting, but we have to be careful. But I think it is possible for us to do that. It just depends on what the suggestions are, whether we may have to then adjust something else in order to make sure we don't have an unintended consequence.
So the things that I had listed last time, maybe if we want to sketch out a list and see if we want to, we can discuss these item by item and see if we want to direct staff to do them, but maybe I'll start that way. The things that I had lined out was 1649-070E, which was by considering solar access conditions, the fact that we had taken out the solar provision of the code seemed to make that potentially irrelevant. The next one that I had made notes on was 1649-080, which was the general provisions. B had said reducing the amount of carbon dioxide in the air seemed inconsistent with promoting urban wildlife habitats. If you reduce the carbon dioxide, I'm not exactly sure what the trees are supposed to live on. And I know that the global warming people think that that's, a piece to that puzzle, but I would want to put that up for discussion. In the same provision C2, we had talked about the possibility on the 7.5% for downtown commercial, creating an exception. It seemed to make sense for zero lot lines. where we would not require landscaping if the code itself had a zero lot line. That was one that I had made note of. Then on, we had also talked about in the landscaping code 080J, not, at least discussing, not having a list of approved tree species. And then we had talked about taking out the Sunset Western Garden Book.
You okay with that, Mr. Savory?
I am.
So those are the, I think that was the, and then keeping lawns weed-free. Which is great, again, this is a great aspirational one, but one that, and that was in 49090E. Those are the ones that I had identified from our last time here that I thought should be subject to some discussion at least.
There was one that I kind of wanted to comment on that you mentioned, and I'm not 100% sure since I'm not referring to it, but the one that lists the required, that a tree must be on the required tree list.
Right.
I'm almost positive that that is referring to street trees, and so it's not really talking about private property trees, because the city only regulates street tree plantings, and
This new street tree code has a list, so if you didn't want the list, you'd have to amend that chapter.
We'd have to ask council because we weren't involved in that. right?
Yeah, and it was just amended, I mean, just a few months ago, a brand-new street tree list, and it only applies to street trees, and because that is a public resource, I guess, and it needs to be managed properly, and it's very important that only certain kind of trees be planted, because otherwise they cause enormous long-term maintenance damage to curbs and sidewalks, and there are leaf droppings that are safety hazard on sidewalks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of science that has gone into developing appropriate street tree lists. And so I just want to make sure you were aware it's not controlling what somebody can plant on their own private property, but just what you should select if you're doing street trees.
Is that clear?
Can you show me where that is? Because when I look at 1649030, there's site review plan, site design and review plan, approval required for all new buildings, all mobile home parks, major building above 60% of value, addition more than 5,000 square feet, and various different things that would seem to me potentially go beyond street trees. And then J,
I didn't bring my code today, of course.
Can you go get mine?
We usually rely on each other to bring a code, and we didn't bring one today.
maybe we can check that then and see
Yeah,
if really
so-
that 080J
We'll see if it
only applies
applies.
to street trees.
I just know that we don't have a list that currently that we've ever been using for anything other than street trees. And so certainly if it does look like it applies, we would want to change it, because we haven't been dictating trees in any other manner on private property.
Or we could, even if we were only to change that to make it somewhat consistent, any new tree planted must be included on the city's list of approved tree species if there is such a list, or something like that, and we don't have to create one.
Well, I would, frankly, I would prefer to see something that would specifically state that this would apply to only public or commercial property, so, and specifically saying that it would not apply to private property, private non-commercial property. That way, there's no ambiguity.
So let's go through these. Is there any, so I've got 6 things that maybe we'll very briefly discuss, or maybe not discuss at all, but 6 things on there. Do we want to add anything else to the list on things we want to just enter right now and see if we want to take any direction on them?
Do we need to address the issue of grandfathering trees that are already on public property?
I think that the now, let me brainstorm here with you a minute on that. That might be best brought up to say on something where, on site design and review, there may already be some exception where you're not required to change an existing tree. I think that would sort of take care of it. I'm not sure where that would be.
I think there's already something in here about getting the arborist. You can't remove a tree, an existing tree, the care and feeding of an existing tree.
Right. And again, all of that is only for street trees.
Yes.
The city doesn't regulate private property trees. Now, there is a caveat to that, just so you understand the nuance. Some of the required street trees are actually planted in the private front yard of a residence because they don't fit in the right-of-way. But they're in what is supposed to be a designated street tree easement, so that the city has the right to come on the private property and assist in designating or maintaining those trees if need be for the benefit of the public or for safety reasons. But generally speaking, it's still the private property owner's responsibility for those trees, even though they are street trees. But we do prevent them from willy-nilly cutting them down as they can do with the rest of the trees on their property, because they were specifically required to be planted by the developer. And so the city maintains some control over those trees by wanting to know you need to seek a permit to take them down. Doesn't mean we don't approve them. We do on a regular basis. But we want something to help protect that tree in the initially to make sure there's a good reason they want to remove it before they do that. And usually what happens is they'll say yes, but you need to replace it somewhere else, either nearby or in town. So some of them have planted a tree in a park in place of the one they've removed on their private property.
Brian, can you tell me where I'm missing out on this? I'm not making the connection. You're saying that it's not for residential. But wouldn't this whole provision be triggered by a planned unit development? And so therefore it would be instantaneously applicable and apply to residential properties.
Right.
Am I missing something there? Or?
Maybe we need to look at the wording again, but
Well, like, for example, like a subdivision, there's language in the subdivision chapter that planning commission can require street trees per chapter. Maybe the issue is you don't have chapter 12 in front of you, the street tree chapter.
which is not in our development code. So what you're asking,
So
yes.
that, in that way, it would apply to residential, but then 1649 doesn't apply to a subdivision. So, but this was 1649 only applies to design review, like commercial buildings. I don't think a PUD would be design review.
Well, if you had a PUD that wasn't a subdivision, or something like a large apartment complex,
Okay.
you want your apartment complex to have trees in it, or it's going to be the ugliest thing you've ever seen. So yes, that section applies to that. But
I think there's some
it's,
language in the R2 zone which allows apartments about landscaping, again, I'm sorry, I don't have my code in front of me.
030B 8 does say, single-family or two-family dwellings and the alteration or remodeling thereof is exempt. So that's the exemption there.
Yeah, that-
Okay.
Because that's kind of goes with that, my idea of if it's not a subdivision, if there aren't individual lots, then it's a large, development, whether it's residential or commercial or industrial, it's on a single tract. And yes, there are landscape plans for the entire site, and you have to meet point requirements, and you have flexibility in what you decide to plant, but you need a variety of landscape material. It's going to include trees most often.
Something that might strike us as wanting some clarification on 1649030, just addressing that, all it says there on when it triggers site design review plan for this portion is major building remodeling above 60% of value. I'm not sure how and when and that's not really landscaping, but obviously it's just, I was thinking about when this applies. How do we apply that and when?
Well, that's
How do we know?
one measure, which is actually pretty difficult for us to do now since we don't have a building department, now that I think about it, because we would have to specifically ask someone as to the value of their
To
building.
self-appraise the value of their improvement?
Self-appraised in order to determine that 60%. It really hasn't been much of an issue because it's rare that you're on that borderline.
Yeah.
You're either making a very small addition to a site, therefore you know it's not, over 50 or 60% of the total value of the property, so you automatically exclude them. Or some of the other provisions are if you're building 5,000 square feet or more. I forget what some of them are now, but it really hasn't been that much of an issue.
Okay.
But what it's getting at is that you're doing more than what exists in either remodeling or changing or adding to what's there by saying 60 rather than 50%. And so that's pretty common that's when your current regulations and standards kick in, and you want the whole site reviewed according to the new standard because you're making substantial improvements to your site. So now it's time to kick in, because most sites that are doing that, they may be 20, 30 years old, and they're non-conforming. They don't meet current standards. So at what point do you make them start considering our current standards? That's one of the parameters, is 60% or more of the value of what's there.
On that first one that I'd mentioned, I'm educating myself as we go, I can tell. I was misinterpreting solar access there, the solar. I think that's what that's talking about, is not blocking out the sun, right? That's talking about not having too many trees to where you're not allowing any sun to come in at all.
I think so.
And so that might be maybe not need to be deleted, which I was my original thought on that. So do we want to go, any other discussion on that first one, that solar access? I'm going to sort of take that off of my agenda to address because it makes more sense now when I looked at a different provision that the light bulb turned on for me. Okay, next one I had mentioned was the 080. We talked about, last time we had mentioned the inclusion in that, what it currently has is promoting urban wildlife habitats and reducing the amount of carbon dioxide in the air. These are under the captioning of general provisions for landscaping. And then these standards are intended to facilitate low-impact development techniques through the retention of existing native vegetation and mature, healthy trees to the extent feasible. Additional low-impact development-related goals of this chapter are to reduce erosion and stormwater runoff, preserve and promote urban wildlife habitats, reduce the amount of carbon dioxide in the air, shade and reduce the temperature of adjacent waterways, and enhance the streetscapes along the city's public rights-of-way with an emphasis on trees and low-impact design stormwater facilities. Quandary. Do we have, in the city of Canby, any actual waterways?
Inside the city limits?
Yeah, we do. Obviously wood
I think
over
so.
past the park over there when you get closer to the river, but that's outside, or
That's
right on the
outside.
edge of city limits.
Yeah.
On the river and along Willow Creek.
You're right here, I guess, along the river we would.
Willow Creek's about the only internal stream that I'm aware of. The others.
The south of edge, the south edge of town would certainly for the
And the
river.
west edge of town.
And it could be someday if, the urban growth boundaries. If all that's expanded within UGB, if you look at the map, so
Yeah.
pretty close to the river.
We're very fortunate, actually, that we don't have the flooding problems that many communities have.
Because we're up on a little bit of a hill.
Yeah.
Okay, let's next go to the zero lot line. That was 080C2. Might be addressing that. Would we want, let me just pose this for discussion purposes, would we want to have an exception to the 7.5% landscaping requirement for buildings that were in a zero lot line zone?
I would say so.
I like the zero lot line because it makes sense with what's downtown. I mean, everything else is.
And how else, I mean, well, I guess you would, the only other way I could see it working is a building that could be zero lot line would be forced to choose to be not zero lot line in order to accommodate having landscaping.
Or roof landscaping.
But they would be their choice.
Yeah.
The zero lot line is usually referring to the front property setback. And so it's not always zero in all four
Oh,
directions.
that's true, it could do it in the
That's
back
what
or
the
something.
memory facility
Yeah.
has. going on.
True, okay.
Because they
They
did,
did a
they had to do the
courtyard
same thing.
inside,
They had
yeah.
the courtyard in the backside, so you don't see it. It's still right out to the sidewalk like it should be. So it can be done. They've shown that it can be done.
But to address your point, if we create the exception, doesn't mean that they have to maximize the zero lot line. They could do less than that anyways. That's fine.
I think one of the things that we should be thinking about is how we can encourage people to in a positive way, to do what we think is the right thing, and rather than saying, coming down very heavy-handed, and so that they're wiggling around. And I'll go back to the library issue. When they were trying to get the proper amount of landscaping in there, they wanted to count the little patches underneath the bike racks
That's right.
towards the landscaping requirement. Well, please, that's, to me, that's maybe that isn't what was intended. So I think that we can clear up a lot of the language throughout this whole thing, rather than, and I agree with Sean that maybe we should be looking at this in a larger way rather than piecemeal. I also like the idea that we're going to, that if we do that we can include language that says what we would encourage, what the city, what we allow, but also the places where the city specifically can't go, what they cannot do. And we don't have any of that. More, you're familiar with Carver, so as well as the next guy. So that's kind of what I'm talking about there. You shall not do something. So I think that if we're clearing up language and going back to one of the things that Brian mentioned earlier, which was the second story issue, there's one thing in here, and I can't remember where I've got so many little purple flags, I've confused myself, that the library wanted to have the appearance of a second story without it actually being a second story. And it's language like that that I think that we need to clear up, so that developers and private citizens can say with some degree of certainty, what is required and what is not required.
So if I could just make a comment, I understand your latter statement, but sometimes it contradicts your first statement, wanting to be encouraging and incentive, because what developers want is clear and objective standards. And if you start saying, oh, we encourage you in a code, it's almost worthless. Because believe me, in almost all instances, they won't do it, or they won't know how to do it because it doesn't tell them how to do it. So they want something clear and objective. And so they want to know they have to meet a certain percentage, or that they can't go beyond this height, or they have to do this, and that's what we ran into with the library. My only recommendation out of all this was, we've got to clarify the two-story requirement, because very intelligent people came up with two interpretations of what the code said. So it obviously needs to be clarified. And so we either need to be certain in our requirement, which we could do with almost one sentence change, and we would be done if we were positive we wanted two-story buildings. And we said that throughout the debate, and there would be no question. But we're not certain whether we want an absolute two-story in all instances. We seem to have some general support for it, but because of that, that makes it a little more complicated, because now we want some wishy-washy language, and we need to figure out how to make the wishy-washy language clear.
Which is hard to do.
Exactly. And so that's where we're trying to decide on specific instances where it's okay to not have a clear two-story building. And I'm still not positive that's where you want to head, but that's kind of what I'm getting from the council, and generally speaking, that, yeah, 2 stories would be good in downtown, but do we absolutely want to require them? Maybe not.
Do we then want to, in trying to figure out a way to balance those two items, should we consider some sort of proposal that says either multiple stories, or you have some sort of landscaping requirement? Therefore, you would not prohibit the attractive city hall look or old-fashioned, library building look of a, ancient schoolhouse or something like that, where they've got a lawn out front and it's this attractive, landscaped, nice commercial thing because it's in the downtown commercial. But you also wouldn't allow those to dominate because they either have to do the landscaping or they have to do the 2-story. Might be something that could be a compromise on something like that.
See where you're going with that.
Oftentimes, when you actually do multiple stories, it frees up, it shrinks your footprint and actually frees up the ability to do landscaping. And so there might be some contradiction there, because the more you go up, the more likely you could do some landscaping, unless you have to do a parking lot. But in most of the downtown area, you don't have to do any on-site parking. So it just becomes building height, and up to the sidewalk or not, 100% lot coverage or not. And if you have a landscape percentage, you can't do 100% lot coverage. Most developers will choose to cover their entire lot with a building if we didn't have anything that restricted them from doing that, because they can maximize their land, and the value of the land is very important. So by requiring landscaping, we're making it more expensive to develop in the downtown area.
Mm-hmm. The one that triggered some discussion before was the nuance. I don't think that any of the three of you were on the commission at the time, but that the church that's now on township, where they had to put in a park bench or something like that.
Put in a park. They had to put in a park, not a park bench. They had to put in.
Well, it had to be a,
The design review menu
Design
to
review
trying to
menu, we
meet
had
that.
have a bench or so.
It
corner.
said, I think we've amended it since then, but it was,
I wonder if we meant to say a park-like.
Yeah, so-
if you look on page 18 of your packet, I think it was that,
Was on the lid chart, the lid.
the very bottom, it says provision, it was a park or open space. And I think what we said was giving some bench or something counted as open space, so they got 2 points.
Okay. And the thing that I was going to go with that is, in the general provisions for landscaping, the existing requirement for residential zones, even though housing is exempt, is 30% for all residential zones. So I cross-referenced, looking back into what would be required to have the 30%, which are not, exempted ones, if they fit into those other criteria to have a site and design review, would be things like retail stores, banks, a bus depot, a church was what made me think of that one, a club or lodge hall. We've got one of those on First Street already. That sort of don't seem to fit into the landscaping world, was what I was thinking.
Those are things, though, in a residential district that all would require conditional use permits. They would all require a public hearing, come before the planning commission, and the planning commission reviews those landscape plans where it's requiring a 30% minimum landscape. And
These are all permitted uses.
in a residential zone,
Unless I'm in the wrong, I'm on the wrong chapter. Maybe that's why. Let's see, 24, not 22, okay. My book is messed up. Laney, I'm gonna need some rescue help here. I skipped 24 for some reason in my book.
Tyler needs a lifeline, or he can call a friend, in which case it's the same thing.
Seriously, it's a mystery. I'm skipping 24. When I turn to the right page, it's not in there. Sorry, guys.
well, we may have to check your book
So
out.
discard what I just said about all those things.
But some of the things you were saying are allowed, I think, in a residential district, but only with a conditional use permit. So they're not going to go in by right. But the question is, if you had a church surrounded by suburban residential homes, which is where most of our churches are, do you want them to have 30% landscaping? Because any non-house that goes in a residential district, whether it's an institution or whatever it is, there's a thought process currently, it's been operating for years and years by this code, that they provide a good quantity of landscaping because most yards have 30 to 40% of their private property is green space. And we keep that now because we have a 70% maximum impervious area standard, which means every residential lot will have at least 30% landscaping. So it's kind of following what the homes are. If you have some bigger use that by whatever method is allowed in a residential zone. So there's some logic to that percentage. And I know for a fact it's not too far out of bound. It may be slightly on the higher end of what's required, but it's not out of bounds from what other communities require. And we've had our code vetted that way in terms of the percentages. The only one that had any question whatsoever was the downtown core business district. Is our percentage higher than normal there? And we believe it is. Otherwise, our standard landscape percentages are right in line with other communities. And our code was updated to make sure of that. It was modernized just a few years ago by a grant by professionals. that made sure we had a modern landscaping code. Doesn't mean it doesn't need some tweaking here and there.
Okay, so let's move past that one. Is there any other comments about the approved tree list, or was that the list of approved tree species?
I think that needs to be really specific, that it is for public property and commercial, not residential. I think it needs to be really spelled out, because I don't see it being that specific.
Okay, any discussion on the weed-free lawn provision?
Well,
I think it's
somebody had a good sense of humor on that. Because if you're going to get rid of,
How many people are going to have enforced that?
well, typically though, you know, all, you know, humor aside, that you're going to insist on weed-free lawns, the way to get rid of weeds is typically through some sort of herbicide. Would that be correct? Roundup.
A lot of manual labor.
Or a lot of manual labor, and I'm 64 years old, I'm just not going to do it. So I'm thinking of some of the recent studies on those herbicides that reach into the ground, then into the aquifers. Of course, I don't like weeds to begin with, but so I do use those sorts of things. But I don't know if that's I don't know how you deal with that.
Probably in reality, if it's more of a high weed and grass kind of situation, where if you had a particular section of town where maybe more than one local business had the worst looking landscaping that was not maintained properly in any manner, it ended up being high grass and weeds, then this gives you an opportunity to potentially do some enforcement action, because you have some statement in your code that says, hey, you have to maintain what you initially planted over time, and that generally speaking, our expectation is when you plant, that it's a weed-free lawn. And in reality, over time, it's not going to be, because no lawn is. But if it got bad enough, you could try to use this provision. I mean, that's the best I could say. There's
So
some argument.
So considering that Baker Prairie and Trail are in high-density residential zone, and there are probably 50 bajillion weeds, right? Should we initiated enforcement action?
See, I would personally caution you in that, I mean, just being around city ordinances for so many years, any planner will tell you that 70 to 80% of all ordinance standards are never enforced. And that's why we have to be overly cautious when we're creating ordinances to think of the administration of them. Do you have the staff to actually do this? If not, why bother? Because we know for a fact 80 to 90%, and people get, I've heard counselors get really upset. Well, if you're going to have it, enforce it. But you can't, because you don't have the manpower to even come close to enforcing half the ordinances that cities have adopted. They always go overboard. They want to correct some, incident that occurred, and then they'll adopt something aimed at that one property, where in reality it wasn't really an overall community problem. It was a problem that day on one property. They passed an ordinance to correct that, and now they expect it enforced citywide. And that's just the practicality of what happens. And people that aren't in government for a lifetime career don't necessarily see that at the time. They see that they're helping solve a problem, but in reality, we get a lot of extra regulations in our book that we can't possibly. And so it's just something to be careful about when we're adding layers of regulation. That it's really something that's important and it's widespread and generally is needed community-wide.
Well, tell me, Brian, if you had your druthers and you had to go through all these landscaping provisions and ordinances and things like that, knowing, based upon what you just said, could we eliminate, I mean, could we make this a lot
That
more
probably,
streamlined and realistic for the,
actually, that would probably be more beneficial than trying to add things, but hey, I like the idea of potentially getting rid of the weed-free, getting rid of the 95% landscape covered within 3 years, because those are practical things that we have not been able to enforce, and so it's extra verbiage that's unneeded. So I thought those were good suggestions. We may need to think of some other way to handle it other than just lowering the percentage. I mean, that's all I thought about so far is, 75% landscape coverage would be something that I think reasonably could be enforced, because I've seen the landscapes plans that have been approved and designed, and some of them look really good, and they never cover more than 75%. But,
Well, to move us forward onto getting something accomplished, we should, at some point, either ask staff to draft up some proposed edits for us to public notice, or, table the whole topic. It doesn't have to be today, but at some point, we either need to take action or not fiddle with it, or something. There's some removals. So do we, are we at a point where we've got items that we want staff to draft up some proposed amendments to, or we still want to discuss it more? I mean, in my vision here would be, if we had staff propose some changes, that would be then discussed in a work session before we put it out for public hearing. But that we move to the next step of asking them to give us some concrete items to consider.
I would say that it needs to be multiple work sessions. I mean, to me, it's not just about the landscape provision. It's about, the sign code. I've tried to weed my way through that. It's horrific. There's this kind of issue, like what Brian was saying. There's so many things that can be pulled out that were just patchwork pieces that were put in by, well, we have an issue right now, so let's put this little provision in here. And maybe we need to just go back and start over. Look at these things and say, is that good or is that bad? I mean, there's a lot of things in this code that's just way over the top, and like Brian was saying, nobody even looks at it or enforces at all. And we want to bring business and make this process easier for people to the city of Canby. Let's look at this code.
When you say something, I understand your sentiment, but I think there's a danger when you say something to the effect of "let's start over."
Well, a little large, yes. Sorry. Are you okay, Brian?
well, exactly.
We've got things like comprehensive plan review and other things that are necessary to,
yes. But I mean, look at this.
Maintain compliance with.
The thing is that we have a whole variety of levels of planning commissioners and the terms that you've been on and what you're familiar with, because you happen to mention one area. The sign code is by far the most controversial code provision any city ever adopts, and it's one that most planners will run hightail the minute somebody says, I want to work on the sign code. And you need to be aware that the city took that seriously, and it wasn't that long ago, it was 4 to 5 years ago now, They completely, a massive project, redid our sign code. And there's been 2 amendments since then on that redone sign code to fine tune it, and it's been working well, at least from my standpoint, because I haven't heard anybody, any businesses or anybody really screaming that it's limiting me too much or that its overall goals aren't working and those kind of things. My first reaction in implementing it was what yours is, if you've read it. Wow, this is complicated. But once you get used to it, I actually find it very easy to implement now. But it took me 6 months to learn it. And it was very difficult that first 6 months.
I've read through it a couple times. It just
Yeah,
gives me a headache.
it was giving me a headache trying.
I'm like, you gotta be kidding
I
me.
finally, it all fell into place, and now I like it much better than the old ordinance, once I learned how to find the answers in it and such, and explain it to people and how they find the answers. Just a
I think
comment on.
there's still some old ordinance stuff stuck in there that needs fine tuning. The picture section is pretty good, I would think, but there's a lot of, the whole code, I mean, has fine tunes, you know, we make notes every day of that needs to be, you know, next code edit, you know, and this needs to be changed. It's going to be a constant.
And I'm perfectly fine with
Yeah.
you guys overriding some sort of general flow of direction that I guide in, but I think that unless you guys do, you sort of direct the commission as a group to do otherwise, that we should take them piece by piece. Like any of the commissioners that find something that says, hey, there's a problem on page this, 16 dot whatever, and then we sort of go and assess that problem, and if it cross-references other provisions that also need to be considered at the same time, then we sort of elaborate that as a whole, but not say, all right, let's spend the next 6 months and go through the entire code book all in one fell swoop. I think we should, because I don't know any other way to do it other than, like you said, you go back to the drawing board or get some grant or something to take a comprehensive review of the entire code, and
Well, right,
that might
right.
be unmanageable.
Right.
You know, I don't, might be. So I would suggest, unless we get something, we say, hey, we got to look at this provision like we did with the sign code, like we're doing with the landscaping code, like we did with that solar access, or solar, whatever that was called, not solar access. You know, then we look at those in detail. But unless we have that, we should maybe wait and do them section by section.
Well, now, Brian, when this goes to, how this process works is we have to come up with some language. You guys bring language to us, and then we push it to a public hearing, correct?
Right,
So,
and
my idea was is that, well, we don't want to do that over and over and over. It'd be nice to collect all of our thoughts and be able to bring them at one time versus, you know, let's look at this little piece and then we'll come back in a month and we'll look at another little piece and keep doing this process. And I don't know if we could just set them aside, you know, as things we talk about and like fix this piece of it and kind of have a rough idea of what we want to do with it, and then set it aside if we got another piece that we want to look at that also.
well, we have 2 mechanisms. I'm trying to think of the wording we've used for our annual code improvement
Yeah.
updates. And maybe that's what we call them, is code improvement. Things that have come up in the implementation of code that staff's noted, we'll make notes, and then we'll try to get to changing those. And so we did a package
It's about a year ago.
a year ago, and it corrected a whole series of things, and many of them came up at a planning commission hearing, were mentioned, we made a note of it, and then we brought them back as a whole code improvement package. And what we try to do with those packages, when possible, are things that we think are not going to be majorly controversial, so that the whole package can be passed. What usually happens when you try to change one item here, in this chapter, another item here, another item over here, and they're scattered all over the code because it's a package of improvements, you'll find that one or two of them are wildly controversial, and none of the rest ever gets adopted because you're focused on the controversial ones. And so the code improvement package is to try to pick things that we think probably will slide through without too much trouble, so the whole thing can be passed and improved rapidly. And then if you have a particular controversial, which I think the landscape and the